After several delays, countries at the COP29 summit in Baku have adopted a $300 billion a year deal. The goal is to help poorer nations cope with the impacts of climate change. But the agreement is sparking backlash as developing countries say it's not enough. Joining us now from Azerbaijan is Broiulette from the Climate Action Network Canada. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Carolyn, first, help us understand what's at stake here. What was the intended outcome of this two-week conference?
The Paris Agreement at its core was a compromise between the additional efforts needed to limit warming to 1.5 degrees and the fact that for countries who are the poorest and on the front lines of a crisis, that they contribute very little, if at all, to cause the resources to partake in those additional efforts. So climate finance is not only a question of justice, of equity, it's also a question of feasibility for those countries who have to lift up millions, often billions of people out of poverty, help them access energy while at the same time leapfrogging fossil fuels and adapting to climate change. And so COP29 was about setting a new long-term climate finance goal that would restore trust in the Paris Agreement and make this respecting this crucial limit of 1.5 degrees possible.
Okay, I want to expand on some of what you said shortly, but first let's talk about $300 billion. Sounds like a lot of money. Explain the criticism with this pledge.
Well, first of all, our previous climate finance goal was of $100 billion a year until 2020. And when you adjust for inflation, $300 billion gets us only very close to this $100 billion goal. It also pales in contrast to the needs of countries in the global south, which can be calculated in trillions. They were asking for 1.3 trillion a year. So we're very far from that. And then finally, when you look at what actually will go into this $300 billion a year goal, it's a mixed bag of things where we are failing to learn the lessons of this 100 billion goal, a mishmash of private and public investments, lack of clarity around how much will go to mitigation or adaptation. We really should have seen this be purely public provision of money in grants so that it doesn't contribute to worsening the debt crisis, which developing countries are currently crushed by.
Okay, and speaking of developing countries, help us understand why those countries are most affected when it comes to climate change.
Those countries, by virtue of their geographic location, are often close to the equator, where we see climate impacts being concentrated, both in intensity and frequency. From a justice perspective as well, these countries have contributed to causing the climate crisis by emitting greenhouse gases in the atmosphere through the burning of fossil fuels, a lot less than rich countries like the United States or Canada, for instance. And so that's why in the Paris Agreement, there is a legal obligation for countries from the global north to contribute this finance to countries in the global south. Again, not only to make things fair, but simply possible. Because for these countries to leapfrog fossil fuels, they need resources on the table to do so.
Okay, let's talk about what's at stake for Canada. We're also affected by climate change. What is our delegation pushing for at these talks?
Minister Guilbeault and his team of negotiators came to Baku sending a signal that Canada was serious of putting public finance at the center of this new goal. Unfortunately, that didn't pan out in how the goal is structured, which is very unfortunate and means that not only in terms of quantity, but quality, what we're doing with this new climate finance goal is putting a Band-Aid on a gun wound. Canada's delegation was also active in other negotiations. We saw them push very hard on the question of transition away from fossil fuels, which unfortunately as well, we did not see agreement this year. This has been postponed to next year as an in extremis way of responding to the really shameless effort of some countries to backtrack this historic deal that was made in Dubai last year. And Canada, despite its important shortcomings at home, has been pushing on the questions of ensuring that gender is a component that we account for when it comes to countries' response to climate change, and similarly for human rights and the rights of Indigenous people. So now that we're going back home after COP29, we'll really be looking for Canada to back its international diplomatic positions by domestic action.
So what happens next? Because it seems that countries are more divided than ever on this issue. We also have a new administration coming into power in the US. What are your concerns as we look ahead?
Definitely, this has been not only the moment where multilateralism has been most at risk, but also one of the moments where it is most important than ever when it comes to the global response to climate change. We saw a climate denier be elected in the White House, but at the same time, 2024 was the hottest year on record, and climate impacts won't stop because of this election. And so through the negotiations, we saw countries like China, we saw leadership from countries like Kenya, Barbados, really step up and show that they are still in. Similar message from Canada as well, to be fair. And so the reality is that the United States never have been a leader in climate negotiators, climate negotiations, pardon me, quite the contrary. They've often been obstructors and blockers and delayers, and that under the Biden administration as well. So they were never the country we were looking up to help us land this crucial climate finance deal. But now that we're headed toward the next COP in Brazil, it will take countries like Canada to redouble on their efforts and resolve to make sure that we continue building on some of the signals that were sent here, and that we land some of the things that we're not able to achieve here in Baku.
Okay, Carolyn, thank you so much for your insight. That's Carolyn Broiulette from Climate Action Network Canada. She's in Baku.